Summer of 1944, somewhere in the hedgerow country of Normandy, a German battery of 4 105mm howitzers sits behind an earthen wall. The guns are loaded, and the crew is ready. A forward observer on the ground has radioed coordinates. American infantry is crossing an open road 400 meters to the west, exposed and moving in column, and the battery commander knows a single high-explosive volley will shred that road and scatter the men like leaves. He reaches for the firing lanyard when a strange sound drifts in from the east. It is not the roar of a bomber, nor the deep growl of a fighter engine. It is a thin, papery buzz, the sort of noise a lawnmower makes on a quiet Sunday afternoon, completely domestic and totally out of place over a battlefield. He looks up through a gap in the camouflage netting. There it is, a tiny, olive-drab airplane drifting across the gray sky at barely 75 miles per hour. So low he can almost see the pilot behind the glass. It carries no guns, no bombs, and no armor plate. It is not diving on him. It is not even turning toward him, just circling slowly like a bird riding a thermal. It is a Piper Cub, a civilian training plane that weighs less than a motorcycle and costs less than a military truck. And the battery commander does exactly what German artillery officers all across France are doing that summer. An act that would later be documented in captured field reports, confirmed in prisoner interrogations, noted in American after-action reviews, and studied in war colleges for the next 80 years. He pulls his hand back from the lanyard, turns to his crew, and gives the order, "Do not fire. Hold position. Maintain silence. Wait." The Americans on the road keep marching. The infantry column he could have destroyed completes its movement and disappears behind a tree line. The most powerful ground weapon in his entire arsenal, the weapon that shattered armies from the plains of Poland to the ruins of Stalingrad, sits loaded and aimed and useless behind its embankment, all because a 65-horsepower airplane with fabric skin and a stall speed of 38 miles per hour is circling overhead. This scene was not an isolated incident, nor was it a sudden failure of nerve by one frightened officer on a bad afternoon. It was the repeated, systemic response of the German artillery arm across the entire Western Front during the final year of the war. Whenever those American spotter planes took off, the German guns fell silent. When the planes landed at dusk, the barrages resumed. When they returned at dawn, the guns went quiet once more. American field reports documented this pattern with clinical precision. Enemy batteries generally remained silent, limiting their fire to a few rounds at dawn and dusk whenever the observation aircraft were airborne. Not because the aircraft attacked them, it almost never did, but because opening fire in the presence of that plane was, as German crews learned, at a cost measured in entire units wiped off the map, very likely the last thing they would ever do. The German army had spent 2 centuries perfecting the science of artillery. Their big guns had broken every army standing against them from 1870 to 1941. Their artillery schools were the finest in Europe, and their ballistic mathematics were unmatched. Yet, by the summer of 1944, those batteries were forced into silence, not by bigger American guns, more shells, or massive bomber raids, but by the presence of an unarmed civilian plane that cost the United States government roughly $2,600 and that any private pilot could easily fly on a Sunday afternoon. Today, let's investigate exactly how that happened. How a country mass-producing training aircraft used them to neutralize the artillery of Europe's most formidable land army, and why a nation that perfected indirect fire over a century of warfare could find no way to stop it. Remember to subscribe for more untold history. To understand why a fabric-covered Piper Cub could silence a battery of German howitzers, we must understand what artillery looked like before observers took to the sky. More importantly, we must look at what the United States Army did differently, because the plane itself was not the true breakthrough. The airplane was just the part you could see. It was slow, obvious, and almost ridiculously vulnerable. The actual breakthrough was something completely invisible. It was a complex system built from separate pieces that no one had originally designed to work together. This system was born from a bureaucratic fight in Washington that very nearly ended the other way. It combined a mathematical innovation from an artillery school on the Oklahoma prairie, the right radio arriving at the perfect moment, and a military culture that trusted the soldier on the ground as the one best qualified to solve the problem. The result was a total revolution in how artillery found and destroyed its targets. And the first to fully realize this massive shift were the poor souls on the receiving end of it. The problem this tiny plane solved was as old as warfare itself. Artillery fires far over the horizon, meaning gunners cannot actually see their targets. Ever since indirect fire tactics emerged in the late 19th century, every major army on Earth wrestled with the same massive question: how do you hit what you cannot see? For much of modern military history, the only answers were math and pure guesswork. Officers calculated the range to the target using paper maps, then figured out the proper gun elevation. They had to factor in wind speed, air temperature, worn-out barrels, gunpowder charges, and even the Earth's rotation. Then they fired, praying the math was accurate, and the target had not moved since the last scouting report. If the crew got lucky, a forward observer on the muddy ground, typically a junior officer with a heavy field telephone or radio positioned in harm's way, could watch the shells land and report back corrections. Left 200, add 100. Fire for effect. But these observers faced severe limits, seeing only what the landscape allowed. Across the rolling fields of northern France, that might mean 2 or 3 kilometers on a clear day. But in the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, where massive dirt banks and thick brush boxed in tiny fields, an observer could see maybe 200 meters, or 300 if he was incredibly lucky. Anything past the next hedge, or over the nearest ridge, was totally hidden, and if the observer was blind to it, the artillery could not hit it. The big guns could only blind fire into the distance and hope for the best. They could rain down tons of expensive shells, hoping something valuable got caught in the blast. But genuine surgical precision, hitting a specific target at the exact right moment, required a set of eyes, and those eyes on the ground were blind. Getting those eyes into the sky was an old concept. Way back in the American Civil War, Union forces used tied-down balloons to spy on Confederate lines. By the First World War, both opposing alliances used planes and balloons heavily to guide their artillery strikes, making these fragile targets so valuable that hunting them down created some of the war's most legendary fighter pilots. In the decades that followed, every major military power knew that spotter planes made artillery devastatingly accurate. However, the observation aircraft used back then were incredibly fast, heavy, and very expensive machines, run by independent air forces with their own strategic goals and distinct chains of command. An artillery commander who desperately needed a spotter plane for 30 minutes had to request it from an Air Force headquarters that already had 100 other missions scheduled that day. They were busy scouting supply lines, mapping out fortifications, or escorting heavy bombers. The artillery request might be approved, or simply tossed in the trash. The plane might show up 3 hours late, or not at all. Even if it arrived, it could be pulled away after 10 minutes to snap photos 60 miles away. The ground commander was merely borrowing someone else's eyes, and the true owner of those eyes had a completely different set of priorities. Communication between the pilot and the gun crew was choked by layers of military red tape and institutional friction. By the time any scouting report actually reached the gun crew, and they calculated the firing data to aim the weapons, the enemy target had often moved, scattered, or been reinforced. The old system was too slow. Those eyes were too far from the trigger. The chain of communication had too many links, but the real breakthrough did not come from a top general or a politician, but from a handful of dedicated artillery officers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, during the late 1930s and early 1940s. This base was the home of the Army's Field Artillery School, the brain center of American military gunnery. And it was on those dusty red clay ranges where two historic concepts finally came together. Their convergence would quietly reshape the entire war, far more than almost any other weapon the nation built. Let's look at the first development, the Fire Directions Center. Before this system, every battery acted as its own independent unit. Each crew selected its own targets and calculated its own math, and fired on their own. Trying to bundle the power of 12 or 36 guns onto one single target was easy on paper but painfully slow, complicated, and riddled with dangerous errors in reality. The new system changed everything, acting as a central calculation hub. If you find this fascinating, drop a like. A team of officers and enlisted men stood ready with large-scale maps, firing charts, and plotting boards, along with slide rules. They could receive a target location from any observer, ground or air, compute the firing data for every gun in the battalion simultaneously, and transmit fire commands to all batteries at once. A single observer could now bring an entire battalion's fire crashing down on one set of coordinates in minutes. If that FDC linked up with adjacent battalions, something they did more and more as the war progressed, a single observer could mask the fire of dozens of guns from multiple units on a single point. No other army had anything like it. The second idea was even more devastating. It was called time on target. Before this new system, when multiple batteries fired on the same target, their shells arrived one after another, because the batteries were positioned at different distances with different flight times. The first rounds would strike, giving the enemy time to hear the blasts and dive into foxholes or scatter from their guns, while the follow-up rounds from more distant guns landed on positions that were now empty or at least dispersed. That split-second warning from the initial shells drastically reduced the lethality of everything that followed. Time on Target solved this by calculating the exact flight time for every battery based on its specific range. They staggered the fire commands, forcing each battery to shoot at different calculated moments so that the first rounds from every gun, whether that gun was 3 kilometers away or 15 kilometers away, arrived on the target at exactly the same instant. There was absolutely no warning. No initial explosion to send men scrambling for cover. Only a sudden, devastating eruption of steel and fire across the entire target area, followed by silence and then the grim aftermath. German prisoners who survived these TOT strikes recalled them as the single most terrifying experience of the entire war. It was worse than air raids, worse than tank assaults. There was no time to react, no time to run, no time to do anything but stand in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The shells simply arrived. But the fire direction center and time on target needed a target. They were a gun without sights, needing an observer who could spot the enemy clearly, continuously, from a vantage point that bypassed the enemy's camouflage. But the standard ground observer, limited by rough terrain, range, weather, and the constant threat of enemy fire, simply could not see enough. The solution was giving the artillery its very own airplane. Not a fast, expensive Air Force warplane flown by pilots answering to a completely different command, but a slow, cheap, disposable aircraft flown by an artillery officer who understood the terrain because he had spent his career studying it from the ground. On June 6, 1942, exactly 2 years to the day before the Allied invasion of Normandy, a War Department directive established what it called organic air observation for field artillery. Each battalion would get 2 light aircraft, 2 pilots, and a mechanic, all assigned directly under the battalion commander's immediate and absolute control. Love military history? Subscribe to the channel. No borrowing from other branches, the artillery now owned its own eyes. The airplane chosen for the job was the Piper J-3 Cub, a civilian trainer beloved by flying clubs and weekend pilots across America. Militarized and painted in classic olive drab, it was redesignated as the L-4. The L stood for liaison, a modest designation for an aircraft that would reshape the battlefield. Troops nicknamed it the Grasshopper, a term coined by Major General Inez Swift, who watched one of the little planes bounce to a landing on rough desert ground in Texas, and remarked that it hopped just like a grasshopper. The name stuck. The plane's specifications were almost laughably modest by military standards. The L-4 used a single Continental engine, producing just 65 horsepower. Its top speed was 85 miles per hour, cruising at 75 and stalling at 38. Its service ceiling was 12,000 feet, though spotter pilots rarely flew that high since the main goal was flying low enough to see individual gun positions, vehicle tracks, and muzzle flashes on the ground. It featured 2 tandem seats, fabric stretched over a welded steel tube frame, fixed landing gear, and an FM radio. It carried no weapons, no bombs, and absolutely no armor. A single rifle bullet could pass straight through the airframe without hitting anything vital. Each plane cost the government roughly $2,600. The entire investment in the very aircraft that would terrorize German forces was less than the cost of a single medium tank. The decision to keep these planes under artillery command rather than handing them to the Army Air Forces came after a bitter bureaucratic battle that almost went the other way. General Henry Arnold and the leadership of the Army Air Forces firmly believed that all aircraft belonged under Air Force command, period. But artillery officers, led by advocates at Fort Sill, argued that an Endry Sill, an observation plane under Air Force control, was practically useless for artillery. The Air Force simply never prioritized a 30-minute fire adjustment mission over its own strategic and tactical goals. The artillery won the fight, but barely. As we look back, this victory gave American artillery an advantage no other army possessed. It gave them their own eyes, spotters who answered to the exact same commanders as the guns. These spotters spoke the language of artillery because the pilots flying them were artillery officers. These eyes could spot a target and instantly translate it into coordinates without passing through any middleman. The entire process from initial sighting to the shells blasting out of the tubes took under a minute. The system faced its first trial on November 9, 1942, during the Allied invasion of North Africa. 3 L-4 Cubs launched under their own power from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Ranger, 60 miles off the Moroccan coast, a feat never before attempted with this aircraft type. The carrier steered into a 25-knot wind, and sailors held each tail until the engines roared at full power, then released it. The Cubs surged forward and took flight instantly, but things quickly took a disastrous turn. Friendly forces mistook the tiny planes for enemy aircraft. The cruiser USS Brooklyn opened fire with 5-inch guns, scattering them. As the Cubs scattered at low altitude, Captain Ford Alhorn took heavy machine gun fire from Vichy French positions and American troops of the 2nd Armored Division, who failed to recognize the small planes as friendly. Alhorn took 5 bullets to the leg before crashing his plane onto the beach. Another pilot crashed behind Vichy French lines and was captured, only to be freed when the garrison surrendered days later. No artillery fire missions were successfully directed before the Morocco campaign ended. This plane, destined to silence German artillery, entered combat shot at by friend and foe alike. Subscribe to follow more of this incredible military history with us. But over the next few months during the early 1943 Tunisian campaign, this radical system finally proved its worth. Pilots learned to skim the front lines, scanning for the telltale muzzle flashes of enemy batteries, tracking the dust plumes of convoys, and spotting freshly dug gun pits, whose geometric shapes were hidden on the ground but obvious from 500 feet up. They learned to hover over target areas, circling slowly, feeding corrections back to the fire direction center as each volley adjusted. They learned to survive in a plane that had no business being over a battlefield by flying low, staying slow, and betting that the enemy wouldn't waste precious ammunition on a target that looked too small to worry about. The first high-ranking enemy commander to notice this tactical shift was Erwin RML himself. On February 18, 1943, during the intense fighting at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, RML penned a letter describing an American spotter plane directing heavy fire from multiple batteries onto every valuable target in sight. If you enjoy uncovering these incredible historic records, please like the video. That letter, published in 1953, remains one of the earliest German admissions that American artillery direction had fundamentally changed. RML was not describing a new weapon. He was describing a brand new form of coordination, a speed and precision in directing converging artillery fires that his own battle-hardened, tactically superior forces simply could not match. Ironically, this was the exact same Kasserine Pass where American forces had just suffered their worst defeat of the war. 6,500 casualties in 5 days. Over 200 tanks destroyed or abandoned. German commanders surveyed the shattered American armor and infantry, concluding exactly what their intelligence had predicted. The Americans had factories, but they lacked real soldiers. They had immense wealth, but they did not possess a professional army of true soldiers. They mocked them as the dollar army, which was far from a term of respect. But even at Kasserine, while the infantry and armor retreated, American artillerymen were taking vital notes. The L-4 pilots flew right through the chaotic retreat, spotting German positions, adjusting fire, and refining tactics. They gathered lessons to Unit Heblide in Sicily, Italy, and the campaign that ultimately broke the German army in France. The infantry had been shattered at Kasserine, But the observation pilots had been educated, and that education held a lesson that would prove decisive. The artillery officers flying those L-4s over Kasserine saw things from above that the fleeing infantry on the ground never could. They realized German tactical success depended entirely on concentration, on massing heavy armor and infantry at one point to break through before defenses could even react. Allied commanders realized the German timetable depended on sheer speed, on moving before Americans could reorganize. They saw that anything slowing down the enemy advance was crucial. Anything forcing the invading forces to halt, scatter, and seek cover bought precious time for defenses to strengthen. Precisely directed aerial artillery became that vital tool. One well-aimed barrage on a key road junction could freeze a column for an hour. That hour was the difference between a breakthrough and a contained threat. While the L-4 pilots at Kasserine did not win the battle by themselves, they proved in the midst of defeat that this observation system could dictate the tempo of an engagement in a way no other asset on the battlefield could match. These lessons were absorbed, codified, and drilled into every fresh pilot and FDC crew shipping to North Africa in the spring of 1943. By the end of the Tunisian campaign in May, the procedures for directing and adjusting aerial fire were fully standardized. Response times plummeted, and radio communication between pilot and FDC was tightly refined. The system that stumbled at Casablanca and flashed brilliance at Kasserine had become a highly effective weapon by Tunisia's end. What followed in Sicily, and then mainland Italy, was a system rapidly maturing under intense combat. Flying over Sicily in July and August of 1943, L-4 pilots faced terrain even harsher than Tunisia. The island's mountainous interior, with its tight valleys and terraced hills, meant ground observers could see nothing beyond their immediate ridgelines. But the spotter pilots saw everything. Winding valley roads lay exposed, as did German gun positions dug deep into reverse mountain slopes, and supply trucks crawling along cliffside tracks that would have been completely invisible from any ground position. German batteries in Sicily learned what Tunisia's understood. Subscribe to follow this fascinating historical journey. When that tiny plane appeared, they stopped firing or they died. In Italy, starting September 1943, procedures grew even sharper. In the lands near Rome, the steep river valleys of the Winter Line and the soggy plains of Anzio demanded far more from these observation pilots than Africa or Sicily ever did. Distances shrank, and German defenses were heavily fortified. Enemy anti-aircraft fire grew heavier and deadlier as German forces dug into prepared positions, pre-sighting their guns to cover the very corridors the L-4s had to fly. Pilots quickly learned to vary their routes, altitudes, and patterns. They learned to use heavy clouds and ridgelines to hide. They learned, often with their lives, which valleys to avoid, and where gaps in the German anti-aircraft net could be exploited. Italy also saw the birth of a new deadly tactical variant code named Horsefly. In these daring missions, L-4 and L-5 planes carried forward air controllers equipped with VHF radios tuned directly to the frequencies of Allied fighter bombers. The pilot would locate targets far beyond artillery range, like hidden supply dumps, key bridges, or troop concentrations, and direct P-47s or P-51s onto them, serving as the airborne eyes for these strike aircraft. These official Horsefly missions debuted on June 28, 1944 in Italy. They proved so devastating that the concept was quickly exported to France. This tactical approach had a psychological side effect just as valuable as the bombs themselves. German infantry learned that the sight of any tiny American plane meant that not just artillery fire, but deadly fighter bombers would strike them within minutes, multiplying the immense psychological suppression. By the time the Allies crossed the English Channel on June 6, 1944, the L-4 system had been refined by 2 years of combat across Africa, Sicily, and Italy. The pilots were highly experienced, and the procedures were mature. FDC operators were now lightning fast and highly precise, and the scale of deployment was massive. The Army purchased thousands of L-4s during the war, exceeding 5,000 by most counts. Nearly 2,700 served in Europe, with 2 planes assigned to every field artillery battalion, alongside more at group, division, and corps levels. There was nearly always a Grasshopper flying over the American front during daylight hours. For German artillery in France, the question was no longer if a spotter would find them subscribe for more. It was simply when. What happened to any German battery firing near an L-4 was fast, efficient, and almost always fatal. The entire process took under a minute. The L-4 cruised just behind the front line at altitudes between 400 and 1,400 feet, low enough to spot individual vehicles and gun positions, and slow enough to circle and observe for hours. The second a German battery fired, its muzzle flash lit up the sky. Even when expertly camouflaged from ground troops, nets only hid guns from horizontal view. They couldn't hide that sudden flash from above. The pilot immediately marked the location on his map. He radioed those exact coordinates straight to command. The FDC calculated the data, passed orders to the battalion, and the American guns opened fire. The observer watched the shells land, radioed in corrections, and the very next volley slammed the target. If we look at Captain John Johnson's own accounts, the sheer speed of this loop becomes unmistakable. He recalled his crews calling in coordinates the moment they spotted ground flashes, and just 40 seconds later, the German artillery was wiped out. Just 40 seconds. In the brief time it took a German crew to reload and aim their next round. They were already being obliterated by the counterfire their first shot had triggered. This is why their guns fell silent. They didn't fear the tiny plane itself, which couldn't hurt them. They feared what the pilot saw and the destruction he could summon. Firing a single round meant exposing their position, and exposing their position meant certain death. The only logical survival tactic was silence. Don't fire, don't move. Give that buzzing insect overhead absolutely no reason to look your way. Stay frozen beneath the camouflage nets. Wait for dusk. When twilight hides, the muzzle flashes from aerial eyes. Only then could they fire quickly and move before dawn. The proud German artillery, which had crushed every single enemy it faced for 5 long years, was reduced to sneaking quick shots at twilight like thieves. If you enjoy this history, hit like and subscribe as we dive into Normandy's hedgerow country. This thick bow-cage terrain was a defender's paradise for infantry, but a total nightmare for the artillery supporting them. Tiny fields and massive hedges choked ground visibility to zero. An Allied forward observer on the ground, crouched low behind those ancient earthen banks, could only see his immediate field and maybe the next hedge. Beyond that, the entire war was invisible. Pushing forward meant crossing open fields under fire from hidden enemy positions. The infantry fought blind, and the heavy artillery behind them fired just as blind, firing massive shells at approximate coordinates because their paper maps couldn't accurately match the chaotic, irregular patterns of the French bow-cage. The L-4 Grasshoppers changed everything. From 500 feet up, a pilot saw the entire mosaic. He spotted gun positions tucked neatly where 2 hedges met. He identified mortar pits hidden in the tree-lined shadows and communication trenches completely invisible to anyone on the muddy ground. The pilot could read the entire defensive layout that the ground troops simply couldn't see. He knew exactly where the machine guns were waiting, where the reserve platoons hid, and which narrow gap the anti-tank guns were watching to trap oncoming Sherman tanks. From above, he could direct devastating fire onto those targets with a precision no ground observer could ever match. This flipped the traditional rules of combat on their head. Normally, the defending Germans held every single tactical advantage. They were heavily entrenched, hidden, familiar with the terrain, and boasted interlocking fields of fire. Yet they couldn't risk calling in artillery support during the day, because the moment a German gun opened fire, the spotter plane overhead caught the flash, and American howitzers immediately hammered the coordinates. The defense was formidable, but their artillery was effectively silenced. And without big guns, even the strongest fortresses eventually crumble if the enemy is willing to pay the blood price. To understand their impact, consider this. From D-Day to VE Day, these planes guided 97% of all missions. Across multiple divisions, airborne observers directed nearly every shell fired. These numbers are absolutely staggering. They prove that by the final year of conflict, the United States artillery relied completely on these eyes in the sky, becoming devastatingly lethal because of them. In just 2 months, Bradley's First Army lost 49 aircraft and 33 brave pilots to combat and accidents. The L-4 crews paid a heavy price. Buzzing slowly over active battlefields in a fragile aircraft that could be downed by a single rifle shot was, by any measure, an incredibly deadly job. German fighters actively hunted these vulnerable cubs, and historic records show the Luftwaffe would often scramble several fighter planes just to swat down one single L-4. The fact that the Luftwaffe considered it worthwhile to dispatch scarce frontline fighters to kill a simple $2,600 spotter plane tells the whole story. Like this video if you love history. Yet, not all of these pilots were content to merely watch. The most famous exception was Major Charles Carpenter, a high school history teacher from Mullen, Illinois, who served as an artillery spotter with the 4th Armored Division under General Patton's famous 3rd Army. For months, Carpenter did nothing but watch German tanks through his windshield, calling in coordinates and waiting for heavy artillery or fighter bombers to strike. But artillery took precious time. Air support was not always available, and those enemy tanks were actively killing his friends down on the ground. So, Carpenter took a step that no military manual suggested and no regulation allowed. He secured 6 M1 bazooka rocket launchers, strapping 3 under each wing of his L-4, and named his modified creation Rosie the Rocketeer. On September 20th, 1944, during the brutal Battle of Ericourt near Nancy, France, advancing German Panther tanks and Panzers threatened to completely overrun elements of the 4th Armored Division. Carpenter flew multiple attack runs, diving straight at the German armor to fire his rockets. That afternoon, he destroyed several tanks. By the end of his combat career, he had officially claimed 6 enemy armored vehicles destroyed. When General Patton heard the news, he called Carpenter exactly the kind of fighter he wanted in his command. Carpenter received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Air Medal, later telling the military newspaper, "Stars and Stripes." The word must have gotten around among the Germans to watch out for those small cubs with bazookas, because every time he appeared, they opened fire with everything they had. "They never used to bother our planes," he remarked. The bazookas were clearly bothering them. Sadly, Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease in 1945 and left the service the following year. He returned to teaching history at Urbana High School in Illinois, passing away in 1966 at age 53. His aircraft was recovered from Austria after the war, painstakingly restored with several original combat bullet holes still visible in its metal frame. Today, you and I can view it at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts. Remarkably, the very last confirmed aerial victory in Europe also belonged to an L-4 crew. On April 11th, 1945, near Dannenberg, Germany, Lieutenants Merritt Dwayne Francis and William S. Martin of the 71st Armored Field Artillery Battalion with the 5th Armored Division flew their L-4, which they had named Miss Me, on Francis's 142nd combat flight. Suddenly, below them, they spotted a German Fossil Storch observation aircraft. Francis pushed his cub into a dive. Both men drew their M1911 .45 caliber pistols and fired out the open cockpit windows, shattering the Storch's windscreen and puncturing its fuel tank. The German plane cartwheeled into a field. Francis landed his cub nearby and walked to the wreckage, capturing both German crewmen, bandaging the observer's wounded foot, before turning them over to a passing American armored column. It remains the only aerial victory in the history of modern warfare achieved using handguns. Francis, who had earned a Bronze Star for saving a wounded soldier under fire, was twice recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross during his wartime service. Yet both times, the bureaucratic paperwork was lost or delayed. He finally received the medal in 1967, over 22 years later. Historian Cornelius Ryan recorded this legendary tale. Subscribe if you enjoy uncovering forgotten wartime events. A single question echoed through every German report and prisoner interrogation during the final 18 months of the war in Europe. Why could the German military not achieve the exact same thing? But behind that question lay a deeper, more uncomfortable truth that German officers rarely spoke aloud, though it haunted their memoirs. How had the Americans, whom they once dismissed as mere amateurs at Kasserine, become the most terrifying artillery force in Europe? By 1944, their firepower was unmatched. To those who faced it, it was easily the most frightening weapon on the battlefield. When Allied intelligence officers asked captured German soldiers what weapon they feared most, the responses were remarkably consistent. They did not fear the tanks, regardless of the sector or division. They did not say air raids, despite their destruction. They always said the artillery. They feared the shells that struck without warning from every direction, impossible to predict and impossible to escape. For them, the infantry could be fought and the tanks could be ambushed, but the American artillery could only be survived. German captives frequently noted the vast volume and accuracy of this devastating fire. Historical records described the devastation in terms that suggested not just physical ruin, but total mental collapse. These coordinated time-on-target strikes produced a deep dread that German veterans carried for the rest of their lives. No other weapon on the battlefield could replicate that pure sense of helplessness. Under air attack, a soldier could run, find cover, and watch planes to predict the bomb drops. But against a time-on-target barrage, they had zero warning. There was no gap between the first blast and the last, and not a fraction of a second to react. The steel simply slammed down, all of it, all at once, and then it was over, and the survivors crawled from the wreckage to count who was missing. The lightweight L-4 was the crucial piece that made all of this destruction possible. Without the airborne spotter, the FDC was a brain without eyes. Without the center, the observer was just a man screaming coordinates into a void. But linked by an FM radio in real time, they formed a closed loop of spotting, calculating, and destroying that operated faster than any enemy could react. The Germans also had their own spotter planes. The Fiesler Fi-156 Storch was, technically speaking, a much better airplane than the Piper Cub. From its very inception, the aircraft was purpose-designed for short takeoff and landing operations. It could become airborne in under 50 meters and land in just 20. With a stall speed around 31 miles per hour, it flew even slower than the L-4. Mechanically robust and superbly engineered, the plane had served in the Luftwaffe since 1937. Roughly 2,900 of these planes were built during the war, and the Storch performed some of the conflict's most dramatic individual missions, including the daring glider, and Storch supported rescue of Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop hotel at Gran Sasso in September of 1943, and one of the last flights into the besieged ruins of Berlin in April of 1945. Yet, as you and I can see, the Storch could not replicate the L-4 because it lacked that unified system. This failure stemmed from a critical institutional decision that the German military high command had made years before the first shot of the war was ever fired. It was a choice that seemed logical back then, but one they could not reverse once the real consequences became clear. German observation aircraft were placed strictly under Luftwaffe control. They belonged to the Air Force rather than the Army, and definitely not to individual artillery battalions. This meant any German artillery commander who needed a spotter plane had to request it from the Luftwaffe, navigating slow, bureaucratic channels and waiting on their priorities. That request might be approved, or it might be denied. It could be delayed for hours, or the plane might arrive only to be pulled away for another mission. The pilot was trained merely to fly, not an artilleryman trained in directing live fire. He often didn't understand what he saw on the ground, and he didn't speak the highly technical language of fire direction. The vital relationship between the aerial observer and the guns on the ground was broken by this deep institutional seam, a bureaucratic wall between two military branches that slowed communication and diluted clear priorities, shattering the immediate, intimate connection between finding a target and destroying it. But the Americans had eliminated this seam entirely. An L-4 pilot was an artillery officer first and a pilot second, reporting directly to an artillery commander. He didn't have to beg the Air Force for flight time, nor did he need anyone's permission to take off. Instead, he simply walked to his plane in a cow pasture behind the battery, started the engine, and bounced down a dirt strip, arriving over the front lines in minutes. He radioed what he saw directly to his own battalion's fire direction center, speaking their exact technical language. The time between spotting a target and firing was measured in seconds. Meanwhile, the Germans, despite having a better plane, had to measure that same response time in hours if they could get a plane at all. They possessed a superior tool stuck in an inferior process. And as history shows, process defeats tools every single time. To see more historical analyses like this, please subscribe. Meanwhile, there was a second absolute problem. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe and Allied fighters completely owned the skies. Any Storch flying over the front lines in France or Belgium became a slow, unarmed, and easy target for every Allied fighter within 100 miles. In contrast, the Americans flew their L-4s with relative impunity, as the crippled Luftwaffe could not field enough fighters to stop them. The L-4s operated safely under an umbrella of Allied air supremacy that the Storch simply could not enjoy. Even if the German military had copied the American organizational model, and even if they had placed Storches directly in artillery battalions with trained pilots and direct radio links to their fire direction systems, those fragile planes would have been blasted from the sky within hours of leaving. Success demanded more than the right aircraft and organization. It required total dominance of the skies. The Americans possessed all three elements, while the Germans had none. But you and I should consider another reason the system works so well, going far beyond mere machinery. The men piloting those L-4s were almost entirely artillery officers who had volunteered to learn to fly. They were not career aviators, but soldiers who deeply understood the ground fight because they were trained for it. These officers had mastered fire direction, ballistics, and observation techniques long before they ever sat in a cockpit. Looking down at the terrain from 800 feet, they did not see what a typical pilot saw. They saw through the eyes of gunners. They saw firing lanes and blind spots on the ground. They recognized the best spots for enemy weapons based on elevation, distances, and the geometry of indirect fire. They could spot a hidden artillery battery, not because the camouflage was poor, but because the position made perfect tactical sense. And if a battery sat there, it had to point in a specific direction. Its ammunition supply would be positioned a set distance behind, and its communication wires would trace specific terrain features. These observers read the ground like a chess master analyzing a board, focusing not on single pieces but on positional logic. This was something German Luftwaffe pilots in their Storch aircraft could never copy. They were purely flyers. A German pilot could spot a target if it lay in the open, but could not deduce its presence from terrain logic. They did not think like artillerymen, because they had never served in the big guns. The Americans put the right mind in the aircraft, not just a pair of eyes. And that mind, trained at Fort Sill and hardened by months of combat, gathered vital clues from ground that a normal pilot would pass without noticing. This was driven by the exact same principle that made the fire direction center and time on target strikes possible seamless integration. The FDC unified calculations from several batteries into one brain, while time on target coordinated salvos for a single impact. Direct aerial spotters linked the eyes of the observer straight to the fire chain of the battalion, while the artilleryman pilot brought the expertise of the gun crew right into the cockpit. At each step, the Americans linked elements that other military forces kept separate. The outcome was not merely additive. It multiplied their strength. Each breakthrough amplified the rest, producing a network of sheer destruction that was vastly more lethal than its individual parts combined. When harsh weather closed over the Ardennes in mid-December of 1944, grounding American spotters, the German guns suddenly roared back to life. For the first time in months, German artillery could shell targets freely without worrying about eyes in the sky. The early success of the Ardennes offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, owed much of its progress to that brief weather window. German gunners supported their advancing tanks and infantry with heavy, constant bombardments they had not managed since before those L-4 scout planes first arrived. For 7 days, the German artillery regained its old strength, and the devastation showed in every sector where their forces pushed deepest. American soldiers holding the Bulge felt this shift immediately. Troops who had grown used to light enemy shelling were suddenly hit by massive barrages that reminded veterans of the worst battles in Italy. German crews were no longer firing quickly at dusk and immediately fleeing. They fired heavily in broad daylight to support coordinated tank and infantry assaults, making the targeted Americans realize a vital truth they had previously taken for granted. The constant pressure from those L-4 spotters was far more than a simple convenience. It served as a protective shield. Its sudden absence meant rising casualties. Then, the skies cleared. On December 23, 1944, the weather broke and the L-4s returned. Official Army records later called the following hours a total field day for the observers. German gun crews who had worked openly beneath the cloudy skies and had not moved because they trusted the fog, were caught exactly where they had stood for days. Position after position was spotted, targeted, and completely wiped out. During the closing months of the war, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, American spotters enjoyed what official records call several field days, unleashing massive fire on the German gunners trying to protect retreating troops crossing the river. Those remaining guns were quickly silenced. During the Battle of the Bulge, the newly rushed proximity fuse made devastating airbursts a routine occurrence, especially when combined with real-time aerial observation. With coordinated mass fires, precise time-on-target strikes, and these proximity fuses, the Fire Direction Center achieved a level of lethality unmatched by any army in history. In October of 1944, during Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, the 82nd Airborne Division's Air Section deployed 10 L-4s, and 11 officers under Major John T.L. flew risky observation missions to protect paratroopers, holding the narrow highway corridor stretching from Eindhoven to Arnhem. By design, these airborne divisions were lightly equipped, lacking the massive heavy artillery of standard infantry units on the ground. But they had their L-4s, and those daring observation pilots made every single shell count, guiding limited artillery fire onto the enemy targets that mattered most. To surrounded paratroopers facing brutal German counterattacks, pinpoint artillery accuracy was far more than just a tactical preference. It was a choice between holding the line and being completely overrun, forcing the L-4 pilots to fly through the war's most lethal conditions. They buzzed low over a narrow corridor lined with German anti-aircraft guns, where the deadly front lines shifted on a daily basis. On October 21st, 3 German fighters targeted Lieutenant Darwin P. Garzel, 4 of the 320th Glider Artillery. Though his spotter plane was riddled with gunfire, Gar's aircraft survived. On the ground, American infantry watched the dogfight and shot down 1 Messerschmitt, killing its pilot. 3 frontline fighters committed to destroying a single unarmed observation plane. This proved how desperately the Germans wanted to blind American artillery. Like this video and subscribe for more forgotten history. Even General George Patton, a commander rarely known for sharing glory, admitted this truth without hesitation. He openly declared that he didn't need to name the war's true victor. It was clearly the artillery. By the summer of 1944, military historian Michael Doubler concluded that field artillery had established itself as the most brilliant performer on the entire American combined arms team. At the absolute center of this deadly system, acting as its eyes, was the tiny L-4 Grasshopper and its fearless pilots. So, here is the answer to that mystery. This mystery began with a question. Why did German artillery go silent when American spotters took off? They stopped because shooting meant instant death. But it wasn't the lightweight plane itself that brought destruction. It was the entire lethal system backing it up. The Fire Direction Center could calculate coordinates for 12 heavy guns in the brief time it took a pilot to finish a single sentence. Then, the time-on-target method, which dropped massive shells simultaneously with absolutely zero warning. The FM radio, connecting the observer directly to the Fire Direction Center. There was also the brilliant decision to integrate observers directly into the artillery battalion, slashing target response times from 40 minutes to just 40 seconds. Yet beneath all of these brilliant technological innovations lay a unique military culture that allowed a high school history teacher to strap bazookas to his training plane and rewarded him instead of court-martialing him. It was a culture that trusted a lieutenant on his 142nd mission to attack an enemy plane with a pistol simply because it felt like the right thing to do. They trusted the lone pilot in the cockpit to evaluate the danger and take decisive action without ever waiting for official permission. On paper, the Germans possessed superior guns and far more experienced crews. They flew a better observation plane and had literally written the book on indirect fire. Yet none of that mattered, because the Americans had built a self-reinforcing system where every single piece backed up the other. It was a network the enemy couldn't replicate without completely restructuring their military culture and fighting under a fundamentally different sky. Fabric and steel worth $2,600. Powered by a 65-horsepower engine that buzzed like a lawnmower, it carried an artillery officer who knew exactly what to look for from his years on the ground. That was the deadly combination that silenced the enemy guns. More than 5,000 of these spotter planes were built during the war. Nearly 900 were lost in Europe, yet the men who flew them are never listed among the aces. These pilots received no flashing headlines, Hollywood movies, or grand victory parades. Those who survived simply returned home and quietly resumed the lives they had left behind. Carpenter returned to teaching high school history. While Francis waited 22 years for a medal the Army kept misplacing. Allorn lived the rest of his life with 5 slugs in his leg from his first day in battle. Most of the pilots who flew those missions left no written memoirs, no recorded interviews, and absolutely no legacy beyond a name on a dusty roster and a service number, or, if they were lucky, a single photograph in an old family album that hasn't been opened in decades. During the final year of World War II in Europe, these simple planes became the most terrifying sight in the sky. It wasn't the massive bombers flying in 1,000-plane formations. It wasn't sleek fighter planes loaded with rockets, but a tiny Piper Cub carrying a radio and a sharp-eyed observer. The formidable German artillery, which had crushed entire nations, could no longer fire in broad daylight because of these small spotters. A single muzzle flash meant instant destruction. Every shot invited total annihilation. Yet, every moment of silence from a German battery, every artillery volley they chose to hold back, and every American infantry unit crossing open ground safely because a German gunner hesitated to fire, represented a silent victory won by an unarmed man in a canvas aircraft. If our historical investigation has shown you a side of the war you had never seen before, hitting that like button helps the story find its next viewer. Every single like, every shared video, and every comment mentioning a father, grandfather, or uncle who served in the artillery or flew those fragile planes serves as a small act of preservation for a history that fades a little more every single year. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are still so many of these historical stories left to tell. These are accounts of regular men in basic machines who recognized a vital duty and acted without waiting for orders. The brave men who flew those grasshoppers, keeping German batteries silent with nothing but a radio and their own eyes, deserve to be remembered not merely as pilots, but for who they truly were. They were forward artillery observers who simply did their dangerous work from 800 feet up in a plane cheaper than a military truck, with absolutely nothing between them and the most devastating weapons in Europe, but thin fabric, pure courage, and 40 seconds